Did Melania Trump's private recording leak because of your office, Attorney General? Did you betray the president who trusted you with everything? Those two questions hit the hearing room like a physical force. And what Pam Bondi did next, what she didn't say, what her hands did, what her face revealed in the 4 seconds of absolute silence that followed, would end her career faster than any document ever could. Nobody expected the most uncomfortable questions about President Trump to come from one of Trump's own allies. That was the trap, and Bondi walked straight into it. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building had been briefed as routine oversight, a formality, the kind of hearing that fills C-SPAN's dead air and generates no headlines. The reporters crammed into the press gallery were there on a tip, vague, unconfirmed, the kind of tip experienced political journalists learn never to ignore. Something was coming. Nobody knew what. Pam Bondi entered with the authority of someone who had never lost a room in her life. Dark blazer, measured steps, the composed expression of a former prosecutor who had been told by every member of her staff that today was manageable. She sat down, arranged her papers, and looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. The most powerful law enforcement official in the United States, ready for another predictable performance of congressional oversight. Andy Biggs entered from the opposite side and did not look at her once, which was precisely why Pam Bondi had not prepared what he was about to do. LTW1. Attorney General, Biggs began, his voice carrying the unhurried tone of a man with nowhere to rush because he already knew exactly where he was going. Are you friends with President Trump? Bondi smiled, a real smile this time, not performance, but relief, an easy opening question from a friendly face. Yes, we are friends. We meet regularly. We discuss priorities, upcoming decisions. In fact, I was with him just this morning. Biggs wrote something on his notepad without looking up. And that relationship, that access, gives you insight into what matters most to the president, his priorities, his concerns. He paused, still not looking at her. His family. The smile didn't disappear, but it recalibrated. The American people already know you had access, Attorney General. Biggs looked up now, and his eyes were absolutely steady. The real question is, what happened behind closed doors when nobody else was in the room? People in the press gallery later reported reaching for jackets they hadn't realised they needed. Bondi's smile was gone. I'm not sure I understand the nature of your question, Congressman. Let me make it simpler. Biggs picked up a document from the folder in front of him, glanced at it, then set it back down without reading from it. The gesture was deliberate. He wanted her to see that he had something. He wanted her not to know what it was. Did President Trump, or anyone acting on his behalf, ever ask you to conceal information related to Melania Trump or to destroy materials connected to her? Bondi straightened. Her jaw tightened in a way that the cameras directly opposite her would have captured clearly. Around the room, the ambient noise of shuffling papers and quiet conversation had stopped. I resent the implication, Congressman. I need a yes or a no. Biggs's voice hadn't changed in pitch or volume. That was what made it land so hard. Did anyone instruct you to conceal or destroy materials related to Melania Trump, yes or no? No, Bondi said. Biggs wrote something. The sound of the pen was audible. Thank you. He paused exactly 3 seconds. Now, I want to ask you about an 11-minute audio recording. There are credible reports, and I want to give you the opportunity to address this on the record, that a recording involving sensitive discussions connected to Melania Trump was leaked to outside parties, and that this leak happened because of a failure inside your office. He looked at her directly. Is that accurate or inaccurate? The colour left Pam Bondi's face, not in the theatrical way, but in the slow biological way, the way a person's body processes information that their mind is still refusing to accept. Her lips parted slightly, her hands folded on the table in front of her, pressed together harder. She looked briefly at the table, then at Biggs, then at the table again. 3 seconds passed. I have always been completely loyal to President Trump, she said. The answer was not an answer. Every person in that room understood it was not an answer, and Andy Biggs moved on as if she had said nothing at all, which effectively she had. Why is it, he said quietly, that every time sensitive discussions happened around you, another anonymous story suddenly appeared in the press 48 hours later? He paused. Let that land. 48 hours, every time, like clockwork. Can you explain that pattern to this committee? Bondi opened her mouth. Anonymous reporting in Washington. I'm not asking about Washington in general. I'm asking about the specific pattern around your office, around your access, around the discussions you participated in. Biggs leaned forward slightly. Because from where many Americans are sitting, Attorney General, it looks less like a mistake and more like a betrayal. Betrayal. Nobody had used that word yet. Not the Democratic members, not the press, not the administration. Andy Biggs, one of Trump's own, one of the loyalists, one of the people Bondi had assumed was on her side of the table, had just used that word on the record, on camera, in a hearing room packed with reporters. Bondi stared at him. Her hands were now completely flat on the table. I have dedicated my career to this president and to this country. That characterization is, let me ask you something different. Biggs slid another paper forward from his folder. Again, he didn't read from it. He just let it sit there between them, visible to her, but not to anyone else. The American people were promised transparency. What they received was a selective version of the truth. Low-level names leaked everywhere. The names the public actually needed to see, individuals connected to serious ongoing federal matters, remained protected, untouched, quietly buried. He looked up. You protected the wrong people, Attorney General, and I think you know it. Bondi's composure cracked, not shattered, cracked. A controlled fracture, the kind that takes years of professional experience to manage. I reject that entirely, Congressman. The decisions made in my office were made according to Attorney General. Biggs set his pen down on the table. The small sound stopped her mid-sentence. I want to be honest with you about something. I came into this hearing as someone who has publicly supported this administration, who has stood at podiums and defended decisions that other members of this chamber questioned, who believed and still believes that President Trump deserves loyalty from the people he appointed. He paused. That is precisely why what I am about to ask you matters more than anything a Democratic colleague could raise. He picked the pen back up. Because the people closest to power are sometimes the ones best positioned to betray it. Because some people in Washington are beginning to ask whether you were acting as the president's ally or someone else's instrument. Bondi's breathing changed. It was subtle. A slightly longer inhale, a controlled exhale. But the cameras were close and the reporters watching their monitors in the gallery caught it. I want to give you an opportunity right now on this record to tell the American people the truth, Biggs continued. Not the managed version, not the version that protects your position, the truth, because the longer this committee sits without that truth, the worse the eventual accounting becomes for you, for this administration, for the people who trusted you with their most sensitive information. He paused again. Because if these failures are real, Attorney General, I don't believe your future inside the Department of Justice will last much longer. He looked at her steadily. So I'll ask you again, was the 11-minute recording mishandled by your office? And did that mishandling reach people it was never meant to reach? The silence this time lasted 6 seconds. Bondi's eyes moved to the document still sitting on the table between them, the one Biggs had never read from, the one whose contents she still could not see. Were your decisions about protecting President Trump, or were you protecting yourself from what you knew might eventually become public? The question came faster this time. Biggs had been building toward it, and he'd arrived before she had time to reset. Bondi blinked. It was the first genuinely involuntary physical reaction she had shown. That question is offensive, she said. You look nervous, Attorney General. The directness of it stopped her completely. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't delivered cruelly. It was delivered the way a doctor states a symptom, clinically, observationally, which somehow made it worse. I am not nervous, Bondi said. I am offended. Perhaps, Biggs said. But those aren't mutually exclusive. He picked up his pen again. Melania Trump trusted very few people inside Washington. Are you telling this committee, under oath and on this record, that trust was never violated? 4 seconds. 4 full camera-captured seconds of silence. I'm not aware of any violation of that trust, Bondi said, but the hesitation had already happened. The 4 seconds were already in the record, and every reporter in the gallery had already written the same sentence in their notes. Biggs gathered his papers with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had accomplished exactly what he came to accomplish. Attorney General, he said almost gently, I have stood beside this administration. I have defended decisions that were difficult to defend. I have carried this message because I believed in it. He looked at her one final time. Which is exactly why I need to ask you this in front of the American people. Are you President Trump's real friend? Or are you the kind of friend who keeps secrets that benefit everyone except him? Bondi said nothing. The silence stretched to 11 seconds. 3 reporters confirmed it later by checking their recordings. 11 seconds. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, confirmed United States Attorney General, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in American history, sat in front of a congressional committee and did not answer the question. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Friday in April 2026, the White House announced that Pam Bondi would be leaving her position as Attorney General, effective immediately. No specific reason was given. The people who had counted those 11 seconds of silence understood exactly what the announcement meant. Andy Biggs had walked into that hearing as a Trump loyalist. He had asked the questions a Trump enemy would never have been trusted enough to ask. And the answers Pam Bondi gave, and the answers she refused to give, told the American people everything they needed to know. The most dangerous accountability in Washington doesn't come from the opposition. It comes from the allies who finally decide the truth matters more than the alliance. Now, I want to hear from you. When the people closest to power start asking the questions the enemies never could, what does that tell you about what those insiders have already found out? Lastly, drop your answer below because this story is not finished, and neither are the questions. But what happened after the hearing may have been even more damaging than the silence itself, because within hours, clips of those unanswered questions were everywhere. Cable news replayed the 4-second pause on a loop. Independent journalists slowed down the footage frame by frame, analysing Bondi's expression, the movement of her hands, the moment her eyes shifted toward the document Biggs never revealed. The internet did what it always does when power hesitates in public. It started filling in the blanks. Inside Washington, phones began ringing before the hearing had even ended. Senior aides reportedly contacted network producers, asking how much footage they intended to air. Communications staff inside the Department of Justice scrambled to prepare statements that never fully addressed the core issue. Every draft sounded carefully engineered, overly polished, almost afraid of the simplest possible denial. And that was the problem. Because when people are innocent, they usually answer quickly, clearly, directly. But Bondi hadn't done that. Every answer had sounded like it was navigating around something invisible sitting in the middle of the room. By midnight, one phrase had started appearing across political media from both sides of the aisle. What was in the recording? Not whether it existed, not whether the hearing mattered. What was in it? That shift terrified people inside the administration more than the hearing itself. Questions are manageable in Washington. Curiosity is dangerous. Because once the public becomes curious, pressure moves in directions nobody can fully control anymore. The next morning, several reporters who had attended the hearing described the atmosphere afterward in almost identical language. Nobody spoke loudly while leaving the chamber. Staffers who normally rushed toward cameras avoided them completely. Even members of Congress who usually loved public confrontation walked out quietly, checking phones, whispering to aides, refusing to answer follow-up questions. One reporter later described it this way: "It didn't feel like a political hearing anymore. It felt like people had suddenly realised something larger was sitting underneath the surface." And then came the detail that made everything worse. Late that evening, an anonymous federal official contacted 2 journalists separately and claimed that the 11-minute recording was not the only material under internal review. There were allegedly other communications, other transcripts, other internal discussions connected to the same timeline Biggs had referenced during the hearing. No evidence was released publicly, no names were confirmed. But the damage had already been done, because now the silence looked strategic. And strategic silence in Washington usually means one thing. Somebody is waiting to see what becomes public before deciding what version of the truth to tell. Behind closed doors, allies who had defended Bondi for months reportedly began distancing themselves carefully, quietly, without announcement. Statements became shorter, public appearances became rarer. Television surrogates, who once spoke confidently about loyalty and trust, suddenly shifted toward procedural language, investigations, timelines, ongoing reviews. It was subtle, but in politics, subtle changes are often the loudest warning signs. Andy Biggs never publicly explained why he conducted the hearing the way he did. He gave no dramatic interviews afterward, no victory lap, no press conference, which only made the entire moment feel more calculated, more deliberate, because people began asking a terrifying possibility. What if Biggs already knew the answers before he asked the questions? What if the hearing had never been about gathering information at all? What if it was about forcing Bondi to react publicly while cameras were rolling? That theory spread fast because the hearing suddenly looked different in retrospect. The pauses, the unrevealed document, the controlled pacing, the moments of silence allowed to linger just long enough for everyone in the room to feel uncomfortable. It no longer looked spontaneous, it looked prepared. And if it was prepared, then someone had been talking behind the scenes long before the cameras ever turned on. That possibility created panic inside circles where trust was already fragile. Because Washington survives on one unwritten rule above all others: allies protect allies until protecting them becomes more dangerous than exposing them. The fear now was that line had already been crossed. Then came another development almost nobody noticed at first. 3 days after the hearing, A scheduled public appearance involving Bondi and several senior administration officials was quietly cancelled. No explanation, no replacement date. Reporters asked questions. None were answered. That silence added fuel to everything. People started revisiting old stories, old leaks, old anonymous reports that once seemed disconnected. Suddenly, journalists were drawing timelines across months of internal disputes, media disclosures, and closed-door disagreements. Patterns that previously looked random now appeared connected. And once the public starts connecting dots, officials lose the ability to control where the story goes next. The most devastating part for Bondi wasn't even the accusations themselves. It was the uncertainty, the perception, the idea that even Trump's closest political allies no longer fully trusted the people standing beside him. Because in modern politics, perception becomes reality long before investigations ever finish. And the image burned into everyone's memory was not a document, not a leak, not even a headline. It was silence. 4 seconds, then 6, then 11. Long enough for millions of people watching to feel that something had gone wrong inside a room built entirely around power. And once the public senses fear from people who normally control every conversation, every microphone, every narrative, the balance changes instantly. That is what made the hearing unforgettable. Not shouting, not outrage, not scandal. Silence. The following week, Washington entered the most dangerous phase of any political scandal, the waiting period. No official confirmations, no dramatic raids, no public evidence released. Just silence, rumours, and the growing feeling that people behind closed doors were negotiating over information nobody wanted exposed. That kind of atmosphere changes behaviour fast. Staffers who normally joked with reporters stopped returning calls. Congressional aides suddenly insisted conversations happen off the record. Former officials who had spent years defending the administration on television began choosing their words carefully, as if every sentence now carried legal weight. And through all of it, Pam Bondi remained mostly out of sight. No lengthy interviews, no emotional defence, no aggressive press conference denying the allegations point by point. Just short appearances, controlled statements, and carefully measured language that somehow raised more questions every time she spoke, because the public had already seen something they couldn't unsee. Fear, not panic, not collapse. Fear contained behind professionalism, and people recognised that instantly. Meanwhile, inside conservative political circles, the conversation became deeply uncomfortable, not because everyone suddenly believed the accusations, but because Andy Biggs had changed the equation completely. If those questions had come from a Democratic opponent, the administration could have dismissed them as political theatre. That playbook was familiar, predictable, effective. But Biggs was different. He was an ally, which meant millions of viewers interpreted the hearing one specific way. If someone that loyal was willing to ask those questions publicly, then the concern inside private Republican circles had to be far worse than anyone realised. That perception spread through Washington like smoke. Then another detail surfaced.